Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Cynthia Morgan laughed as she poured the cold tea over Brittany's head in front of the estate lawyers. The liquid was cloying and smelled of artificial bergamot, dripping from Brittany's hair and soaking into the collar of her faded gray sweater. It was a calculated move, executed with a flick of a diamond-encrusted wrist, while the three men in charcoal suits watched in stunned silence. "Oops," Cynthia said, her voice a melodic trill that didn't hold a hint of regret. She set the china cup back on its saucer with a delicate clink that echoed through the mahogany-paneled library. "My hand slipped. But then again, you've always been a bit of a spill hazard, haven't you, Brittany? Just a mess waiting to happen." Brittany didn't move. She didn't wipe the tea from her eyes or gasp at the chill. She sat perfectly still in the high-backed velvet chair, feeling the wetness seep into her skin. Across the room, Selena Morgan didn't even look up from her phone, her thumb moving in a rhythmic swipe as she edited a photo of her own pouty reflection. "Mom, you're getting tea on the rug," Selena muttered, her voice flat and bored. "That's Persian. It cost more than Brittany's entire life." "You're right, darling." "My apologies to the rug," Cynthia said, smoothing the front of her $4,000 Chanel suit. She turned her gaze back to the lawyers, her eyes hardening into flint. "Now, back to the matter at hand. My husband is barely in the ground, and I won't have the help lingering in the wings like a vulture. Mr. Henderson, tell her." Mr. Henderson, a man whose skin looked like crumpled parchment, cleared his throat and avoided Brittany's gaze. He shuffled the papers on the desk, the sound of the heavy bond paper scratching against the wood like a warning. "The provision for the live-in caregiver was specific, Miss Morgan. Since the primary patient has passed, the residency clause is no longer in effect." "In plain English, Henderson," Cynthia snapped. She leaned forward, the cloying scent of her midnight jasmine perfume filling the space between them. It was a heavy, suffocating smell that Brittany had learned to associate with every lie the woman had ever told. "It means she's out," Cynthia said, her eyes fixed on Brittany. "Tonight, I want your bags packed and your person off this property by sunset. You've played the part of the devoted little mouse long enough. The inheritance is settled, the accounts are locked, and there is no longer a place for you at this table, or in this house." Brittany finally reached up, slowly wiping a drop of tea from her eyelashes. Her hands were steady, far steadier than they should have been for a woman who had just been rendered homeless and penniless. She looked at the woman who had spent the last 5 years treating her like a footstool, a woman who didn't realize that the disguise of a downtrodden caregiver was a choice, not a condition. "I see," Brittany said. Her voice was low, a calm contrast to Cynthia's sharp edge. "You're sure about the accounts being locked, Cynthia? Everything is in order." Cynthia let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Are you questioning me? I've spent the last 6 months ensuring that every cent my husband earned is exactly where it belongs, under my thumb. You think a girl who spends her days changing bedpans and mashing potatoes understands the complexities of a multi-million-dollar estate?" She stood up, her designer heels clicking with predatory precision on the hardwood floor as she walked around the desk. She stopped inches from Brittany, looking down at her with a sneer that pulled at the corners of her perfectly Botoxed face. "You're nothing," Cynthia whispered, loud enough for every witness in the room to hear. "You're a charity case we tolerated because it looked good for the cameras. But the cameras are off now. You have 4 hours to get your thrift store wardrobe out of my sight. If I see you on the security feed after 6 p.m., I'm calling the police to have you removed for trespassing." Selena finally looked up, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "Make sure she doesn't steal the silver on her way out, Mom." People like her can't help themselves when they see real luxury. Brittany stood up. She didn't look like a threat. She looked like a girl in a wet sweater with no place to go. But as she turned toward the door, she paused, her hand brushing against the small, encrypted thumb drive hidden in the pocket of her jeans. It was a small weight, but it contained the digital trail of every offshore account Cynthia had tried to scrub, every fraudulent transfer, and the forensic proof of the paternity lies that would turn the Morgan legacy into a pile of ash. She She looked back at Cynthia, who was already gesturing for Mr. Henderson to pour her a celebratory glass of sherry. "The sun sets at 5:42 today," Brittany said softly. Cynthia paused, her glass halfway to her lips. "What?" "The sunset," Brittany repeated, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I wouldn't want to be late, I'll be out long before then, but Cynthia, you might want to check the mail tomorrow morning, or better yet, check the morning news." "Is that a threat?" Cynthia demanded, her face reddening. "You pathetic little, it's a weather report," Brittany interrupted, her voice as cold as the tea that had been poured over her. "Storms are coming." "I'd hate for you to be caught unprepared." She walked out of the library without looking back, the sound of her own footsteps silent on the rug that cost more than her life. She had 4 hours to initiate the sequence. 4 hours until the forensic audit she had been running in secret for 3 years went live to the federal authorities. As she reached the grand foyer, she pulled out her phone and tapped a single name in her contacts. "It's time," she said into the receiver. "Flush the accounts, every single one." Behind her, she heard the muffled sound of Cynthia's laughter echoing from the library, the sound of a woman who thought she had won. Brittany stepped out into the afternoon sun, the heat beginning to dry the tea on her skin. The countdown had begun, and by tomorrow morning, Cynthia Morgan would find out exactly what happens when you pour ice-cold water on a sleeping lion. The smell of industrial bleach struggled to mask the cloying scent of lilies drifting from the foyer. Brittany Morgan stood in the kitchen, her damp uniform replaced by a spare set of gray scrubs that felt like sandpaper against her skin. She didn't mind the discomfort. It served as a grounding wire for the electricity humming through her veins. On the marble counter, a burner phone vibrated once, a silent signal that the first phase of the data extraction was already bypassing the Morgan family's private server. The swinging doors burst open, the sound of heavy mahogany hitting the stopper echoing like a gunshot. Cynthia Morgan marched in, her silk robe billowing behind her like a shroud. She wasn't alone. Selena Morgan followed, her face illuminated by the artificial glow of a smartphone held at arm's length, while Mr. Henderson trailed behind them, clutching a leather briefcase with the grim posture of a man attending a funeral. "I want her out of these quarters by tonight," Cynthia said, not looking at Brittany but addressing the air as if she were speaking to a ghost. She gestured vaguely toward the staff wing. "She's a contagion. First the tea, now this insolent silence. I won't have it under my roof." Selena giggled, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Don't worry, Mom. The clumsy caregiver reel is already at 50,000 views. Everyone thinks she's a joke. I even tagged the local news under staffing horror stories." Brittany watched the girl, her biological sister, perform for an invisible audience. The cruelty was so casual, so practiced, it almost felt artistic. She turned her gaze to Mr. Henderson. The lawyer's eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something, pity or perhaps warning, crossing his weathered features before he looked down at his shoes. "Actually, Cynthia," Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, his voice thin in the vast kitchen. "Per the terms of the trust maintenance agreement, a summary dismissal requires a signed acknowledgement of final payment. If you want her gone tonight, we need her signature on the waiver of liability." Cynthia snapped her fingers, and the lawyer produced a single sheet of paper. She snatched it from him and slapped it onto the counter, right over the spot Brittany had just scrubbed. "Sign it. It's a check for $5,000, more than you'd make in a year of scrubbing floors. Take the money and vanish before I decide to sue you for emotional distress." Brittany looked down at the document. It was a standard gag order disguised as a severance agreement. By signing, she would forfeit any right to claim a connection to the Morgan estate. She felt the weight of the burner phone in her pocket. The audit was at 22%. "Is there a problem?" Cynthia leaned in, the scent of expensive gin and resentment sharp enough to sting. "Or are you holding out for more? You've always been a parasite, Brittany. Even when you were a child, lurking in the corners, staring at things that didn't belong to you. You thought if you stayed long enough, you'd become one of us, but look at you. You're just the help." Brittany picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. She signed the name B. Morgan in a sharp, jagged script that looked nothing like the flowing cursive she used for her professional certifications. "I'll be out by the morning," Brittany said, her voice a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate the copper pots hanging above them. "Morning," Selena groaned, finally lowering her phone. "But the Foundation Gala is tomorrow night. I wanted to film you serving the appetizers. It would have been the perfect before and after for my rebranding campaign." Cynthia waved a dismissive hand. "She can stay in the basement until the caterers arrive. Then she leaves through the service entrance. I want her to see what a real event looks like one last time. Let her see the life she'll never touch." Brittany tucked her hands into her pockets, her thumb brushing the screen of the burner phone. A new notification had appeared. Access granted. All offshore accounts mapped. "The gala," Brittany repeated softly. "The one celebrating the family's unwavering integrity." "Exactly," Cynthia sneered, turning to leave. "Something you wouldn't understand. Henderson makes sure the locks are changed the moment the last guest leaves tomorrow night. I want her scent scrubbed from this house." As the trio swept out of the room, the lawyer lingered for a heartbeat. He looked at Brittany, his mouth opening as if to speak, but the sharp call of his name from the hallway pulled him away. Brittany stood alone in the silence of the kitchen. She pulled out the phone. The countdown timer for the final data dump was set. In 18 hours, the Morgan Foundation Gala would begin. In 19 hours, the federal servers would receive the encrypted files detailing 20 years of Cynthia's systematic embezzlement and the DNA evidence that would strip Selena of every cent of her inheritance. She looked at the check for $5,000 sitting on the counter. With a slow, deliberate motion, she picked it up and fed it into the industrial trash compactor. The machine groaned, the metal teeth shredding the paper into confetti. "You're right, Cynthia," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm going to see the life I'll never touch, and then I'm going to watch you lose it." The timer on her screen ticked down. 17:59:59. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was already inside the house. The morning of the Morgan Foundation Gala arrived with the suffocating scent of lilies and the sharp, chemical tang of expensive hairspray. The estate was a hive of frantic activity, a choreographed chaos of florists and caterers scurrying across the marble floors. Brittany stood in the shadows of the grand staircase, her fingers brushing the cold, rectangular edge of the encrypted thumb drive hidden in her pocket. It felt like a live wire against her thigh, a concentrated burst of power waiting to be unleashed. Cynthia stepped into the foyer, her voice cutting through the air like a serrated blade. She was already draped in a silk robe that cost more than most people earned in a year, her face a mask of cold perfection. She spotted Brittany and stopped, her eyes narrowing with a look of profound distaste. "Why are you standing there like a gargoyle?" Cynthia snapped, waving a manicured hand toward the library. "The caterers need the silver polished again. I saw a smudge on a dessert fork. If this event isn't flawless, I'll ensure your recommendation letter is as empty as your bank account." Brittany didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, watching the way Cynthia's pulse thrummed in her neck, a tiny, frantic beat of a woman who didn't realize her world was about to catch fire. "I'll get right on that," Brittany said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the storm of Cynthia's ego. "See that you do," Cynthia sneered, leaning in close enough for Brittany to smell the expensive, cloying perfume that masked the woman's rotting character. "After tonight, your services will no longer be required. I've already hired a professional firm to handle the transition. You'll be out of this house by dawn. I've even been generous enough to have the staff pack your meager belongings into trash bags. It seemed appropriate." The insult was designed to sting, to remind Brittany of her perceived place at the bottom of the social ladder. Instead, it felt like a gift. Every cruel word was another brick in the wall of Cynthia's own prison. "I understand perfectly," Brittany replied, her eyes locked onto Cynthia's. "Everything will be settled by dawn." Cynthia huffed, satisfied by what she mistook for submission, and swept away toward the ballroom. Before Brittany could move, Selena appeared from the dining room, clutching a crystal flute of mimosa. She was already wearing her influencer face, the wide, vacant smile she used for her millions of followers, though her eyes remained as sharp and cold as shards of ice. "Oh, look, the charity case is still here," Selena giggled, the sound high-pitched and grating against the morning silence. She walked in a slow circle around Brittany, her designer heels clicking rhythmically on the marble. "Mom's right, you don't fit the aesthetic of the new Morgan brand. I'm doing a legacy reveal live stream tonight, and having a frumpy caregiver in the background would just kill the vibe. Maybe you can find work at a shelter. You'd blend right in with the gray walls." Selena reached out, flicking a stray thread on Brittany's modest cardigan with a look of pure loathing. "Actually, I have a pair of shoes that need buffing. The help is busy with the centerpieces. Be a good girl and handle it, would you? Consider it a parting gift for all the hard work you've done." Brittany felt the heat of a rage spike, but she channeled it into a cold, hard focus. She didn't look at the shoes. She looked at the girl who was the product of a 20-year lie, a girl who was about to lose the very name she used as a weapon. "I have something more important to attend to first, Selena," Brittany said, her voice dropping an octave. "What could possibly be more important than my wardrobe?" Selena scoffed. "The truth," Brittany said simply. Selena laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The truth is you're a nobody. Now, get to work." She turned her back, dismissing Brittany with the casual arrogance of someone who believed they were untouchable. Brittany waited until Selena disappeared upstairs before slipping into the library. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, bathing the room in a dim, amber glow. Mr. Henderson was already there, standing by the mahogany desk. He looked older today, the weight of the documents in his briefcase visible in the slump of his shoulders. "Brittany," he whispered, his voice heavy with professional gravity. "Are you absolutely certain? Once I submit these filings and verify the audit trail during the gala's keynote, there is no going back. Cynthia will be facing federal embezzlement charges, and the paternity suit will trigger an immediate freeze on all Morgan assets." Brittany pulled the thumb drive from her pocket and placed it on the desk. The small piece of plastic looked insignificant against the backdrop of the massive library, but they both knew it was a thermal detonator. "The DNA results from the lab are attached to the final audit report, Mr. Henderson," Brittany said, her voice devoid of hesitation. "The evidence shows Cynthia diverted $3 million from the foundation into offshore accounts in Selena's name over the last 18 months alone. She didn't just steal from the estate, she stole from the charities my father spent his life building." Mr. Henderson touched the drive, his fingers trembling slightly. "And the identity verification. It's all there. My birth certificate, the original trust documents my father hid in the floorboards of the guest house, and the forensic match. I am the only legal heir to the Morgan estate. Selena is a stranger to this bloodline." The lawyer nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. "I've prepared the injunctions. The moment the Foundation's board of directors sees this, they will have no choice but to strip Cynthia of her chair. And the police? Well, Officer Miller is already briefed. He'll be waiting at the perimeter of the gala." A sudden crash from the hallway signaled a florist dropping a vase, followed by Cynthia's shrill screaming at the staff. The sound echoed through the heavy doors, a reminder of the toxicity that had ruled this house for 2 decades. 2 hours, Brittany whispered, looking at the clock on the mantel. "In 2 hours, the guests arrive. In 3 hours, the world finds out who the Morgans really are." "And what will you do?" Mr. Henderson asked. Brittany looked toward the window, watching the sun catch the gold leaf on the estate gates, gates that would soon be locked against the women who had treated her like trash. "I'm going to put on my best dress," she said, her voice cold and final. "I want to make sure I'm standing right in front of Cynthia when she realizes that the nobody she spent years belittling is the one who just took everything away." She turned and left the room, her footsteps silent on the rug. The countdown was no longer a timer on a phone. It was a heartbeat. The gala was about to begin, and Brittany Morgan was ready to claim her throne. The silk of the midnight blue gown felt like a second skin, cold and unforgiving against Brittany Morgan's ribs. It was a far cry from the scratchy wool sweaters and faded aprons she'd worn for months while playing the role of the dutiful, downtrodden relative. As she reached back to pull the zipper, the metallic rasp echoed in the hollow silence of her small room, a sound as sharp as a blade being unsheathed. She didn't look like a caregiver anymore. She looked like the storm that was about to break. A heavy, rhythmic thudding against her door shattered her focus. Cynthia Morgan didn't knock. She demanded entry with her knuckles. Without waiting for a response, the older woman swept into the room, the cloying, suffocating scent of lilies trailing behind her like a funeral shroud. She was draped in gold and lace, her neck adorned with a diamond necklace that Brittany knew, with forensic certainty, had been purchased with embezzled company funds. Cynthia stopped dead, her eyes raking over the blue silk with a mixture of confusion and immediate, vitriolic disdain. "Where did you get that?" she snapped, her voice vibrating with entitlement. "I told you to wear the black uniform. You're here to ensure the catering staff doesn't steal the silver, not to play dress-up in things you clearly can't afford." Brittany didn't flinch. She turned slowly, the movement fluid and practiced. "The black uniform didn't fit the occasion, Cynthia. Tonight is about the truth. I thought I should look the part." Cynthia let out a sharp, jagged laugh. The truth is that you are a charity case I've tolerated out of the goodness of my heart. You look like a thief who climbed through a window and found a closet." She stepped closer, the heat of her anger radiating off her. "Take it off, now. Or I'll have the guards drag you out of this house before the first car even pulls into the driveway." "You still have 10 minutes, Brittany said, her voice dropping to a level of calm that made the air in the room feel thin. 10 minutes to tell the guests the truth yourself. Tell them about the audit. Tell them about the offshore accounts. If you do it now, I might leave you with enough of a reputation to find a small apartment somewhere." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant, muffled sound of the orchestra tuning their instruments downstairs, a dissonant screech of violins. Cynthia's face contorted, her features sharpening into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. She reached out, her manicured nails digging into the silk of Brittany's shoulder. "You're delusional," Cynthia whispered, her breath smelling of expensive gin and malice. "You have nothing. No one will believe a word from the mouth of a girl who spent her life scrubbing floors. You're a footnote in the Morgan legacy, and tonight, I'm finally crossing you out." She turned on her heel, her gold heels clicking a frantic, rhythmic beat against the hardwood as she stormed out. Brittany exhaled, the tension leaving her shoulders but her heart remaining a steady, cold engine. She reached into her vanity drawer and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. It felt heavy in her palm, a physical weight of justice. She tucked it into the hidden pocket of her gown just as Selena Morgan appeared in the doorway. The younger woman was busy adjusting her ring light, her phone held aloft like a sacred relic. "Mom's losing it," Selena muttered, not even looking up from her screen. She pouted for a selfie, the flash momentarily blinding. "She says you're having a breakdown. Honestly, Brittany, don't ruin my engagement announcement tonight. My followers are expecting a fairy tale, not a family drama with the help." "I'm not the help, Selena," she replied quietly. "And you might want to check your filters. They can't hide everything." Selena rolled her eyes, a gesture of practiced boredom. "Whatever, just stay in the shadows where you belong." As Selena drifted away, Mr. Henderson stepped into the hallway. He looked at Brittany, his expression unreadable to anyone else, but she saw the slight nod, the signal that the final documents had been filed and the witnesses were in place. "The gates are open," he said softly. "The first guests are arriving." Brittany felt the vibration of her phone in her hand. A text from Officer Miller, in position. Say the word. She looked at her reflection one last time. The girl who had been belittled, gaslit, and discarded was gone. In her place stood the woman who held the keys to the kingdom. She walked toward the grand staircase, the sound of her own footsteps lost in the rising swell of the music below. The trap was set, the mercy had been rejected, and the countdown had finally hit 0. She reached the top of the stairs, looking down at the sea of diamonds and champagne, waiting for Cynthia to look up and realize the floor was already gone. The scent of Casablanca lilies was so thick it felt oily, coating the back of Brittany's throat as she moved through the crowded ballroom. It was the smell of overcompensated guilt, the kind of fragrance Cynthia Morgan always chose when she was trying to hide the rot beneath the surface. Crystal chandeliers hummed with a low electric vibration, casting fractured light over the sea of silk and tailored wool. To the 300 guests sipping vintage Krug, this was the social event of the season, a celebration of the Morgan legacy. To Brittany, it was a beautifully decorated slaughterhouse. She adjusted the strap of her clutch, feeling the hard, rectangular weight of the digital recorder tucked inside. Her dress was a simple, charcoal-colored silk, elegant enough to pass, but modest enough to remain invisible to eyes trained only to spot labels. She didn't need to stand out yet. The predator was most effective when the prey was busy admiring its own reflection. At the center of the room, Cynthia stood beneath the largest chandelier, holding court. She was draped in emerald velvet that cost more than a year of a nurse's salary. A vintage Cartier panther coiled around her throat. The diamonds in the panther's eyes glittered with a predatory light that matched her own. She was laughing, a sharp, practiced sound that didn't reach her eyes, as she gestured toward a group of investors. "It's about heritage," Cynthia said, her voice carrying with the practiced projection of a woman who had never been told to be quiet. "My father built this firm on the principle that some are born to lead, and others are born to support that leadership. It's a natural hierarchy." Brittany watched from the edge of a marble pillar. The irony was a bitter pill she'd been swallowing for weeks, but tonight it finally tasted like honey. The heritage Cynthia boasted about was a lie built on forged signatures and a stolen bloodline. Selena was a few feet away, her phone held aloft by a harried-looking assistant as she filmed a live stream for her 1,000,000 followers. She was pouting at the camera, her sequins catching the light like fish scales. "Hey, guys, we are at the Morgan Gala, and literally the vibes are so elite. My mom is about to make the biggest announcement in the history of the company. Stay tuned, because things are about to get iconic." Selena caught sight of Brittany, and her expression curdled instantly. She didn't lower the phone, instead turning the camera slightly away as if Brittany were a smudge on a lens. Look who crawled out of the basement," Selena hissed, loud enough for the nearby guests to turn. "I thought we told the help to stay in the kitchen tonight." A few socialites chuckled, their eyes raking over Brittany's understated dress with collective disdain. The first rage spike hit Brittany's chest, a hot, familiar pulse, but she channeled it into a calm, steady breath. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply watched the way Selena's hand trembled slightly, a tell that the influencer was more nervous about her mother's approval than she let on. "I'm just here to see the finale, Selena," Brittany said, her voice a cool contrast to the room's sweltering ego. "You wouldn't want to miss the climax of your own story, would you?" Selena rolled her eyes, turning back to her camera with a dismissive flick of her hair. "Whatever, just don't stand near the buffet. You're ruining the aesthetic." Brittany moved on, her heels clicking a rhythmic countdown against the polished floor. She spotted Mr. Henderson near the mahogany bar. He was nursing a scotch, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but when his eyes met hers, there was a sharp tectonic shift in his gaze. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply tapped the face of his watch once. 10 minutes. She felt a vibration in her palm. A text from Officer Miller. "Side exit secured. We have the perimeter." "Waiting for your signal." Brittany tucked the phone away. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching the room from a great height. These people, the board members, the city councilors, the gossip columnists, they were the witnesses she had carefully curated. They were the jury Cynthia had spent a lifetime trying to impress, and they would be the ones to watch her world turn to ash. "Brittany!" The voice was like a whip crack. Cynthia was approaching, her emerald train hissing against the marble. Her face was flushed with champagne and triumph. She stopped inches from Brittany, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the lilies. "What are you doing out here?" Cynthia demanded, her voice a low, dangerous snarl. "I told you to stay in the back. This isn't a place for someone like you to mingle. You look like a funeral director in that rag." "Perhaps I am," Brittany replied, her eyes locked onto Cynthia S. "I'm here to pay my respects to the Morgan legacy." Cynthia's eyes narrowed, her hand flying to the diamond panther at her throat. "You've always been an ungrateful, cryptic little brat. After everything I've given you, a roof over your head, a name, you still stand there with that pathetic, judgmental look on your face. You should be on your knees thanking me that I didn't leave you in the gutter where I found you." The second rage spike was colder this time. Brittany thought of the years of gaslighting, the way Cynthia had systematically stripped away her confidence, the way she had used Brittany's own father's death to chain her to a life of servitude. "You didn't find me in a gutter, Cynthia," Brittany said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade. "You found me in my father's house, and you've been a guest in it for far too long." Cynthia let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Your father's house. This empire is mine. I built the walls, I bought the furniture, and I own the ground you're standing on. You are a footnote, Brittany, a mistake I'm tired of correcting." She leaned in closer, her breath hot against Brittany's ear. "Enjoy the champagne while you can. Tomorrow morning, your bags will be on the sidewalk. I'm done playing mother to a stray dog." Cynthia straightened her spine, smoothing her velvet dress with a look of supreme satisfaction. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't think Brittany had one. She turned on her heel and began walking toward the raised dais at the front of the room, where a mahogany podium stood beneath a spotlight. Brittany watched her go. She felt the weight of the digital recorder again. She felt the presence of Henderson moving toward the AV booth. She felt the silent authority of Miller waiting behind the heavy oak doors. The room began to quiet as Cynthia stepped onto the dais. The string quartet faded into a lingering, dissonant note. The guests turned, glasses in hand, their faces expectant. They were waiting for the announcement of a new era, a merger that would solidify Cynthia's power for decades. Cynthia reached the podium and tapped the microphone. The feedback hummed through the hall, a sharp, piercing sound that made several people wince. She smiled, the light hitting her diamonds until they were blinding. "Friends, colleagues, family," Cynthia began, her voice echoing with absolute authority. "Tonight is not just about looking back at where we've been. It's about claiming what is rightfully ours. It's about the truth of the Morgan bloodline and the strength of the woman who carries it." She looked directly at Brittany in the back of the room, a smirk of pure, undiluted malice playing on her lips. Brittany didn't look away. She reached into her clutch and pressed the play button on the remote link to the house speakers. "Wait for it," Brittany whispered to the empty space beside her. The room was silent, 300 pairs of eyes fixed on the woman at the podium, unaware that the mahogany gallows had already been built and the rope was already around her neck. The speakers didn't just play a recording. They exhaled a confession that turned the air in the ballroom to ice. Cynthia stood frozen at the mahogany podium, her hand still raised in a gesture of triumph that now looked like a plea for mercy. "The girl is a Morgan, but she doesn't need to know that." Cynthia's voice boomed through the hall, stripped of its public polish and replaced with a jagged, predatory greed. "As long as the board believes the papers I forged, the inheritance stays with us. Brittany is nothing more than a glorified maid in her own father's house." The silence that followed was physical, a heavy weight that pressed down on the 300 guests. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic clink of a chandelier swaying in the sudden draft. Cynthia's face underwent a grotesque transformation. The practiced, porcelain mask of the triumphant matriarch cracked, then shattered. Her skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the heavy contour on her cheekbones look like streaks of ash. Her lower lip began a frantic, rhythmic twitch she couldn't suppress, and her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, widened until the whites showed all the way around the irises, darting like a trapped animal looking for an exit that didn't exist. Her throat worked invisible, convulsive swallows, but no sound came out. She looked smaller, suddenly, as if the lies had been the only thing keeping her upright. Selena Morgan, standing just a few feet away, let her gold-plated smartphone slip from her fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, final crack that echoed like a gunshot. She didn't reach for it. Her influencer's pout had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror as she realized the lifestyle she'd built on a foundation of theft was dissolving in real time. "Turn it off!" Cynthia finally shrieked, her voice cracking into a high-pitched gale. She lunged for the microphone, her movements clumsy and desperate. "It's a deepfake, a fabrication. Security, remove that woman." But the security team didn't move. They were looking at Mr. Henderson. The family lawyer stepped into the light of the stage, his expression as grim as a tombstone. He held a thick manila folder, the seal of the state probate court visible on the front. He didn't look at Cynthia. He looked at the crowd, then at Brittany, who remained standing at the back of the room, her silhouette framed by the grand arched doorway. "The recording is authentic," Mr. Henderson announced, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of legal authority. "And the forensic audit conducted by Brittany Morgan has been verified. The DNA results Cynthia provided to this board 2 years ago were indeed tampered with. I have the original, uncorrupted files here." A collective gasp rippled through the room. A prominent donor at the front table stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he physically moved away from the stage. Others followed suit, a slow-motion retreat that left Cynthia and Selena isolated on a mahogany island. The smell of expensive lilies in the room suddenly felt cloying, like the scent of a funeral. Brittany began to walk. The sound of her modest heels on the marble was steady, a rhythmic heartbeat that commanded attention. She didn't rush. She didn't shout. She moved with the quiet, terrifying grace of a predator that had already won. As she passed the tables of the city's elite, people she had served drinks to only weeks ago, they parted for her like a dark sea. She stopped at the foot of the stage, looking up at the woman who had spent 2 decades trying to erase her existence. The light from the crystal chandeliers caught the single, modest diamond Brittany wore, a gift from her father that Cynthia had tried a dozen times to steal. "You told everyone I didn't belong in this family, Cynthia," Brittany said. Her voice was low, but in the dead silence of the hall, it reached every ear. "You called me a charity case. You told me I was lucky to even breathe the air in the Morgan estate." Cynthia gripped the edges of the podium so hard her knuckles turned a ghostly white. Her breath was coming in shallow, ragged hitches. "Brittany, listen to me. We can talk about this." "We're done talking," Brittany interrupted, her tone as cold as a winter morning. "I didn't just audit the accounts. I audited your soul and I found you completely bankrupt. You spent 20 years telling me I was a mistake. It turns out the only mistake was thinking I wouldn't eventually audit the truth." Brittany turned to Mr. Henderson and nodded once. "Officer Miller is waiting in the foyer," the lawyer said, his voice devoid of pity, "along with the eviction notice for the estate. You have 1 hour to collect your personal effects. Anything purchased with Morgan funds stays." Cynthia collapsed back into the ornamental chair behind her, her legs finally giving out. Selena was sobbing now, a messy, ugly sound that had no audience. Brittany didn't stay to watch the final collapse. She didn't need to. She turned her back on the stage, her coat swirling around her ankles as she walked toward the exit. She reached into her clutch one last time, feeling the cold, heavy weight of the original house keys. She stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her, muffling the sound of the chaos she'd left in her wake. As she walked toward the waiting car, she didn't look back. The countdown was over. The debt was paid. And for the first time in her life, she was going home. The glass doors of Morgan Holdings didn't just open. They hissed, a sound as sharp and clinical as a guillotine. Cynthia Morgan marched through them, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the white marble floor. She looked like a woman who had survived a shipwreck, but was still trying to command the lifeboats. Her designer scarf was frayed at the edges, and the aggressive scent of lilies, her signature perfume, couldn't mask the sour, metallic odor of a night spent in a state of pure, unadulterated panic. Behind her, Selena Morgan trailed like a ghost, her face stripped of the heavy filters and carefully applied contouring that defined her online persona. She clutched a designer handbag that was now the most valuable thing she owned, her eyes darting toward the security guards with a look of profound, shivering realization. "I am Cynthia Morgan," Cynthia's voice cracked, echoing through the cavernous, high-ceilinged lobby. She slammed her hand onto the polished reception desk, rattling the glass vase of orchids. "Call the board of directors, call the legal department. I want that. That parasite arrested. She stole my keys. She's squatting in my estate." The receptionist, a young woman with a sharp bob and a steady gaze, didn't flinch. She looked at Cynthia with the kind of detached pity one might reserve for a fallen statue. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Morgan. Your access credentials were revoked at midnight. You're not on the visitor list." "Revoked? Do you know who I am?" Cynthia screamed, her face contorting into a mask of jagged fury. "I built this name. My husband's blood is in the foundation of this building. You're a minimum wage nothing. Get me the CEO now." "The CEO is expecting you, actually." A voice cut through the air, cold and precise as a winter morning. The elevator doors at the far end of the lobby slid open. Brittany Morgan stepped out, but the woman who emerged bore no resemblance to the quiet, invisible caregiver who had spent months scrubbing floors and enduring insults. She wore a bespoke charcoal suit that fit her like armor, her hair pulled back into a sleek, professional knot. She carried a slim leather folder, her movements radiating the quiet, terrifying confidence of someone who had already won the war before the first shot was fired. Cynthia froze. Her jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to unhinge, her mouth forming a silent, jagged O that made her look 20 years older in a single heartbeat. The frantic, manic light in her eyes died instantly, replaced by a hollow, grayish glaze as the blood fled her face, leaving her skin the color of wet parchment. Her hands, which had been clawing at the air just seconds ago, went limp at her sides, the fingers twitching rhythmically as if she were trying to grasp a reality that had already dissolved. She looked less like a socialite and more like a ghost witnessing its own funeral. "You," Cynthia whispered, the word barely a breath. "What are you doing in those clothes? Where did you get the money for?" "The money was always mine, Cynthia," Brittany said, her voice echoing with a calm authority that silenced the entire lobby. "Every cent you spent, every designer bag Selena flaunted, every drop of wine you poured over my head. It was all drawn from a trust you had no right to touch." Mr. Henderson stepped out from behind Brittany, his expression as grim as a tombstone. Beside him stood Officer Miller, his thumbs hooked into his utility belt, his presence a silent promise of handcuffs and cold steel. "The forensic audit is complete," Mr. Henderson announced, his voice carrying to the small crowd of corporate employees who had gathered on the mezzanine to watch the fall of the Morgan matriarch. "The paternity fraud wasn't just a moral failing, Cynthia. It was a criminal one. By misrepresenting Selena's lineage, you've spent 24 years embezzling from the Morgan family trust under false pretenses. The total sum, including interest and the liquidated assets you sold off, exceeds $80 million. Selena let out a small, whimpering sound, her knees buckling until she had to lean against a structural pillar for support. The employees above whispered, a low hiss of judgment that filled the room like rising water. "It's a lie," Cynthia hissed, though her voice lacked its usual venom. She looked at the security guards, her eyes pleading. "It's a mistake. My husband loved me." "My father loved the woman he thought you were," Brittany corrected, stepping closer until she was inches away from the woman who had spent years treating her like a servant. "But he was a businessman. He left a fail-safe. He knew that if the truth ever came out, the sleeping lion clause would activate. I am that clause, Cynthia. I am the auditor, the beneficiary, and the one who just signed the order to freeze every account associated with your name." Brittany reached into her folder and pulled out a single, stamped document. She didn't hand it to Cynthia. She laid it on the marble desk between them. "You told me once that I didn't belong in your world," Brittany said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft whisper. "You said I was a parasite feeding off your greatness, but look at you now. You have no home, no money, and no legacy. You're standing in my lobby, screaming at my staff, wearing clothes bought with my father's stolen money." Cynthia's eyes darted to Officer Miller, then back to Brittany. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror. "Brittany, please, we're family. You can't do this to Selena. She didn't know." "She knew enough to laugh while you humiliated me," Brittany said, her gaze shifting briefly to her sister, who was now weeping openly into her hands. "She knew enough to enjoy the spoils of your theft. Ignorance isn't an alibi, Cynthia. It's just a different kind of debt." Officer Miller stepped forward, the jingle of his handcuffs a final, sharp punctuation mark. "Cynthia Morgan, you're under investigation for grand larceny and corporate fraud. We have a warrant to search your remaining personal storage units and a court order for your immediate surrender of all Morgan-owned property." Cynthia looked around the lobby, the marble, the glass, the empire she thought she owned. She saw the faces of the people she had looked down on for decades, all of them watching her collapse with a hunger for justice that felt like a physical weight. "I'll sue," Cynthia croaked, a final, pathetic spark of the old bully flickering in her eyes. "I'll take everything back." Brittany didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply turned her back, the fabric of her suit whispering against the air as she walked toward the elevators. "You can't sue with money you don't have, Cynthia, and you can't win a fight against the person who owns the battlefield." As the elevator doors began to close, Brittany caught one last glimpse of them. Cynthia was being led toward the exit by Officer Miller, her head bowed, her expensive heels dragging on the floor she had once walked with such unearned pride. Selena followed, a broken shadow of a girl who had finally realized that her followers couldn't save her from the truth. The doors hissed shut, plunging the elevator into a peaceful, humming silence. Brittany leaned back against the mirrored wall, her reflection steady and cold. The reckoning was done. The debt was paid. But as the floor numbers climbed toward the penthouse office, she felt the weight of the silence. She had won everything, but the house she was going back to was still empty. She pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped a contact she hadn't called in years. "It's over," she said when the line picked up. "But I think I need to find out who I am when I'm not looking for revenge." 6 months had passed since the gilded doors of the Morgan estate had been padlocked by the state, yet the silence of the city still felt heavy with the ghost of the scandal. Brittany Morgan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new firm, watching the rain-slicked streets of the financial district 20 stories below. The air in the office smelled of expensive parchment and the faint, sharp scent of ozone from the cooling server racks. She adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse, her movements precise and devoid of the feigned clumsiness she had worn like a shroud for 3 years. A soft chime echoed through the suite. Mr. Henderson stepped inside, his usual stern expression softened by a look of genuine respect. He carried a single, slim mahogany box. He didn't wait for her to ask. He simply placed it on the obsidian desk that dominated the room. "The final liquidation is complete, Brittany," he said, his voice resonant in the quiet space. He no longer looked at her as the tragic ward or the invisible caregiver. To him, she was the woman who had performed a master class in forensic demolition. "The Morgan holdings have been fully restructured under your name. The last of the predatory liens Cynthia tried to hide have been scrubbed. The ledger is officially clean." Brittany didn't reach for the box immediately. She walked to the window, the cold glass pressing against her fingertips. "And what of the others?" Mr. Henderson sighed, a sound of weary finality. "Cynthia Morgan is currently residing in a 40-unit complex on the edge of the industrial district. It's a far cry from the penthouse. I'm told she spends most of her time arguing with the building manager about the quality of the water. She tried to sue the estate for a maintenance allowance last week. The judge dismissed it within 10 minutes. She has nothing left but the clothes she walked out in, and a reputation that ensures no one in this city will ever take her call again." He paused, glancing at a tablet in his hand. "Selena is struggling. Without the Morgan name or the trust fund to fuel her social media presence, her followers vanished like smoke. She's working at a high-end boutique in the mall, ironically enough. She spends her days folding the same designer scarves she used to buy by the dozen. Officer Miller mentioned he saw her at a bus stop last Tuesday. She didn't recognize him. She looked smaller, he said, like the air had been let out of her. Brittany finally turned. The satisfaction she expected to feel wasn't a roar of triumph. It was a cold, steady hum of justice. She remembered the way Cynthia used to sneer at her, the way she had called her a charity case, while stealing the very air she breathed. She remembered the sound of Selena's laughter as she recorded Brittany's humiliations for the world to see. Now, the world had seen the truth. "She's working a job she used to mock," Brittany murmured, the irony tasting like iron on her tongue. "I wonder if she still thinks people like us don't belong in nice places." "She's learning the value of $1 for the first time in her life," Mr. Henderson replied. "It's a harsh curriculum, but she was a dedicated student of her mother's arrogance. They both were." He gestured to the mahogany box. "Inside is the original deed to your mother's childhood home. It's yours again. I've already sent a crew to begin the restoration. The rot Cynthia allowed to settle in those walls is being stripped away." "Thank you, Ryan," she said, using his first name for the first time. It was a sign of a new era, one where she was no longer a pawn in a game of inherited cruelty. When he left, the office returned to its humming silence. Brittany opened the box. The paper was yellowed, smelling of old cedar and the faint, sweet scent of dried lavender, a scent her mother had loved. She touched the ink of her mother's signature, her heart tightening. She had won. She had reclaimed the legacy that had been bled dry by a woman who valued status over blood. But as she looked out at the darkening sky, the victory felt bittersweet. She had spent so long being a sleeping lion, sharpening her claws in the shadows, that the peace of the aftermath felt alien. She had dismantled her family to save her soul, and while the justice was proportional, the house she was going back to was still empty. The cost of the revenge wasn't the money or the effort. It was the realization that she had been forced to become a predator just to survive the people who were supposed to love her. She picked up her phone and saw a notification from a local news app. A small headline at the bottom of the "Where Are They Now?" section featured a grainy photo of Cynthia carrying a bag of groceries into her cramped apartment. Her hair was unkempt, her face lined with a bitterness that no amount of expensive cream could ever smooth away. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had traded her humanity for a crown made of glass, only to watch it shatter. Brittany closed the app and set the phone face down. She walked to the balcony, the rain now a steady downpour. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and neon. She was no longer looking for revenge. She was no longer a caregiver or a victim. She was finally, for the first time in her life, just Brittany. She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. The ledger was clean. The debt was paid. And as the rain washed the dust from the glass, she realized she didn't need the Morgan name to be powerful. She had built her own throne out of the wreckage they had left behind. The lion was no longer sleeping. She was simply finished.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.